Monday, December 20th, 2010. We're in the Express Studio at CMC. I'm Jim Mayola, and it's my pleasure to be talking again to Jack.
Jack Norris, that is.
Jack Norris.
Yeah.
Jack Norris, you got a lot of history. You have an amazing story, and this is going to be part two of your story. We started off with part one, and you told the story about growing up in what is now Somerville, and you actually rode down on a mule cart down Main Street when you were a little boy.
Yeah.
A great story. Everybody should take the time to listen to that story. But you've been telling me some other things about what happened to you growing up, and you said that you had a job working at Mathers. Talk about that a little bit.
I'm going to stop and start again 1
Okay.
hour, no more, because these things get boring after a certain point. And toward the end of the first tape, we were sort of racing through things and trying to get to the second part.
Sure.
And I said to myself, oh my golly, I said, stop. And let's talk about something like Mathers. Well, when I was in college, and this is in the 1956, 57 era, I came home at Christmas, and my mother got me a job at Mathers department store.
Now that was right on Main Street.
Right on Main, where Coffee Music is
Okay,
now.
yeah.
And Kleenex up there, please.
Sure.
Yeah, thank you. And not that I have anything, I've just been out in the cold a lot. Anyhow, it was the best experience. And I was a sort of a gopher in the store because of a holiday. And there was this beautiful young girl there. Her name was Nancy. Can I give her last name?
If you want.
Yeah, Nancy Lindsay. And she was 1 year older, and she was going to then Western Maryland. Well, anyhow, it was perfect heaven. And what I did go for work. Then during the day, we would wrap Christmas presents.
Okay.
And then there was an old black truck, I remember. And we would then deliver these Christmas presents all around Westminster. So people could come to Mathers,
Right.
get their Christmas presents, and we would wrap them, then deliver them to wherever anybody wanted delivered.
No kidding.
Yeah,
Wow.
and you know, it's you could go to Hutzler's and all the rest of them. You could get your gift wrap, but just think that was a service to Mathers. And Mathers also, if I'm not mistaken, the family, Manning Parsons was the last president. He and his sister, and by the way, Manning went to Trinity, where I went to college, and that's how I got to know Manning. He's about 6 years later than me. But they also owned a department store in Frederick. And so, but that had closed, and Mathers was their last store. And this was in, as I say, the late 50s, somewhere around 56, 57. I have to tell you that one of life's darkest moments for me. I took Nancy home to lunch. And nice young woman. I mean, I still have fond memories of her. And as we were walking back, I went to hold her hand.
Yeah.
And she looked at me and she said, that's just a silly thing to do. You know, in those days, the girls really did control dating situations, much more so than the easy come, easy go in today's society. And she turned out, I think, was dating Harvey Bear at the time, in which I didn't know.
Yeah.
And so that was a little bit of history. Well, as going back and reiterating and going to the ice skating on Thomas Pond, and which you had to have a key to do, and getting myself to know and befriend the Reedy family and Mimi Reedy, then getting to know Tanny Bixler, whose father owned Bixler Drugs, and getting all that back in perspective, because that's important, because I then went into the service after I graduated from Trinity and came back home after going through Army OCS, which we talked about the last time. And I called Tanny up, and that's how I met my wife, because by calling Tanny, Ann Russell, Ann Murphy Russell, was at Tanny's house, and Tanny says, I know somebody, Jack, you can call. And so that begins the next saga as we get into the next phase of this. Because I never really left Westminster. I mean, this is, even though my family moved to Baltimore, they then came back to Westminster, but over the years, I was always involved somehow coming here, and I mentioned the last time coming back to visit people. But one of the things I did, and have a fond memory of, there used to be the parish hall right behind Ascension Church, and here's Ascension Church.
Okay, can you hold it up?
Yeah, 1846.
There it is, okay.
1846 it actually started. It's been in existence now, I guess, over 160 years. But there was a parish hall almost resembling the architecture of the present Stone Church. And it was a small place, and that was eventually raised in favor of the big parish hall that's there now.
Right.
And I still remember coming up here. I was at McDonough at the time, and my mother engaged me in the dancing classes, and I think a Mrs. Rutan actually taught these dancing classes. And I come up from McDonough to go to the dancing classes. So, and then, as I said, over the years, we come back and see people. And finally, came back in the late 50s, and then we're back here into where we are now. Then, after my wife and I got married, as I talked about the last time, we were all over the place. New York, Chicago, North Carolina, all these different places. But we'd always return home for Christmas or something like this. And meantime, Ascension Church was still a part of our life. We got married there on June 18th, 1960. And then the 1971, my mother was buried from Ascension. And my aunt's father, the minister, buried him in 1917. Brooke, our oldest child, was baptized at Ascension in 1963. John, our second child, the minister, baptized him because my mother was sick and couldn't go to the church, and it was done on Gist Road. And so where I'm coming from, that church has really been a part. Oh, by the way, Ann's mother was also buried from the church. So that church, part of our total background, was always part of our lives. So we kept coming up here for various functions. And it was interesting to note over the years the transition going on as far as traffic up into this neck of the woods. Where sometimes when I was in college, I would take bus. There was a direct bus to Baltimore down the Greyhound terminal. But eventually, after 1958, there were no more trains because the trains were discontinued, and there was one last passenger train. So Reisterstown Road became actually the aorta, the artery, to bring people up here. And of course that became congested and eventually led to 795 and 140. But I remember all these events over the years. 140 going from 2 lanes on Westminster Pike to 4 lanes, cutting through pasture. No traffic. No traffic. And so to see this. And as I remember, we would stop at Reisterstown Plaza, which was sort of south of Pikesville. And boy, that was a nice, and I think I mentioned this last time, that was a nice shopping center. They had Hochul Cohn's, I think Stewart's, or one of the 2 major chains, Turks, but then finally its demise. And people would go over to Hunt Valley or over to Towson. But Hunt Valley never was much until now it is. But at that time they had a Sears and some other type of stores, but it never really took off into the time frame I'm talking about. So we would come up and stop at Reisterstown Plaza or do something, but we'd always be here. And we'd sort of come the day after Christmas, because both sets of parents were here. As I said, my father didn't die until 1975. And the day after Christmas, we would tie it in from a trip from wherever we were, and we would go to Williamsburg for a couple of days. So, you know, we were constantly on the road between Westminster and here, leading to finally all the parents, now deceased, my wife and I coming back here in 1987. And we stayed with my wife's mother at that point. And I was going through a transition after having closed the business and starting up myself again, reinventing myself. And we stayed in Sandymount on Old Westminster Pike. And Ann's mother was an interesting lady. She taught school in the system and for 33 years. And she would, I can't say die because she's already deceased, but she would, I don't even know how to say it, but she wouldn't believe I'm going to say what I'm going to say. She was the original, what I call feminist, in the sense, not the Betty Friedan, Gloria Steinman, but the feminist in the sense she lived on the Eastern Shore, and to come up here in the 30s to teach school, she would take a train to a location, I don't know whether it was Cambridge or where it was, I think it was somewhere around that area, and then take a ferry over to Annapolis.
Right.
Then the Washington and Baltimore-Annapolis Railroad took a train to Baltimore, which was an interurban, then a bus up to Westminster.
Wow.
Just think of that. In other words, how a person in 30, here was a woman, and basically women couldn't do much but be teachers, and she taught, I think, on the other side of Silver Run in a one building schoolhouse, and then eventually through a very standard transition got married, and the family lived in Harrisburg, and after that point then she moved back here, and my wife was born in Harrisburg in 1940 on November 22nd, and that's when they moved in with the Russell family, which was an old name in the area, and they lived out in the Sandymount Bethel Road area. Then Ann's mother built this house on Old Westminster Pike, and it's still there. And this is the house that Ann and I returned to in 1987. And her mother was just a gem of a human being. I mean, really somebody that was well respected in the community and gave 30-some years of service to the school system. And for reasons that I can't explain, we moved to Green Street. And now we get into the interesting phase of the saga. Because on Green Street, the first thing I started seeing was vandalism to my house. This was in the early 90s, 1991. And then other people around me. Well, we knew who the children were. They were lived on Westmoreland Street, and this is their passage over to the Union Avenue area, to our area. And this vandalism, because it was at this time that police could no longer slap people on the hands and say, go home, and I'm going to tell your parents. They had to have just cause in order to apprehend somebody. And I found out at that point that you can complain as an individual all day long, but until you have a group of people, nobody listens to you. And finally, these young people kept graffiti on the back of people's houses, ripping screen doors, coming onto people's property, just complete disregard for anything private. And it was at that point I began my activism. And I organized the whole community over there. And at that point, I got the police involved. And that's my beginning of my story with the police department, Major Brewer and Sam Leppo at that time frame through this activism. And my thing was at that point, we had had similar situation in Chicago where we lived with kids just having total disregard for property. And I said, I'm in my late 50s, early 60s, whenever this was, and I said, I'm not going to tolerate this anymore. And everybody, including somebody who had been in the police department that was involved, wanted to do anything for fear that these kids would do further retaliation. And I said, I'm not taking it. And that's when I organized the families. And the city council, and his first name was Sam, or helped us organize. You ought to have heard those people that night. If the parents of these children had heard what some of these, when can I shoot these people? In other words, people had taken their tolerance to the umpteenth level. One thing I want you to learn out of this, possibly Jim, and I don't mean to be sort of looking down or this, where everybody can learn from this. The only time that you have to take this type of absolute abuse is you don't have to take it, in other words. You don't have to. You have to organize yourself. And the only way you organize is to get with other people with the same cause, and you can do something about it at that point.
So what was the outcome, Jack?
The outcome was the police got involved because it wasn't my calling up saying somebody had stolen my pumpkin. It wasn't somebody calling up and saying their lights had done. Meantime, the kids kept expanding because they kept getting away with it. And the juvenile criminal system is terrible. And it is terrible if you read about it in the Baltimore Sun and everywhere else. And it was created in a benign time. In other words, kids get into the juvenile system, give them a slap, give them some time. But the time these kids got into it, they'd already been annoying people for 3 to 4 years. From the standpoint of the parents, all 3 of their children ended up in jail eventually. And if possibly had been a better benign time when the police could do something. But the juvenile system it's still bad. In other words, it gets you in there, but by the time you get in there, you've had lots of abuses, and you get a slap in the hand, oh, this is your first time. And it wasn't designed for murder and killings and stuff like that. And it needs to be rejuvenated, even today. I mean, if you look at some of these young people in Baltimore, 15, 16, they go into the system, and the system says, okay, you've been a juvenile at this point, and your records will be closed after you're 21, you get back in society. But that's not the point. The point is that we need to address the problem for these young people. I mean, and so what used to be stealing something or putting like Tom Sawyer whitewash on a fence has become murder and killings and things like that. And it was at that point, into that time frame, that I sort of endeared myself to the police department. And as we talked about earlier, the Westminster Police Department in the early 90s was rinky-dink in the sense that the bottom floor of the Armory, downtown Westminster, was where the police department was. And Sam Lepo asked me to get involved. Major Brewer, who was his assistant, did, which I did at the time. And I went to city council, said this is something that we need to do. We need to get a new building. And I really feel good about this, even though some people will never give me credit. Nobody likes to give credit.
Now you say the police department was it Longwell Armory?
Yes.
Oh, the police department was in the basement of Longwell Armory.
Yeah.
I'll be darned. I didn't know that.
Yeah. And I'm saying that figure yourself a criminal from Baltimore coming up here. That reminds me of a story. This one guy came up here, and he committed his robbery, and then he couldn't get a cab to go back to Baltimore. You know, there was no transportation. But no, and so I said they needed a presence to show anybody who is a criminal that, you know, we have an outstanding police department. And as a result of those efforts, I then was asked to be in a Baltimore Sun video, which you've seen, and there I am in that video speaking from the outside the prison, and my feelings on what the police department is and why we need it. And we really, Westminster does have a good police department, and if people will notice that not many crimes happen without a very soon thereafter apprehension.
Absolutely.
And we are very fortunate, and I really feel good about myself having gotten involved at that point and getting the building and the support for the police department. And then, oh my golly, this was a sad time. I did a radio show, which was for 3 years, and with Dwight Dingle, and it's called Good News with Jack Norris. And I'd start off this radio show. Yeah. Good News. This was on Saturday morning, part of his lineup on Saturday morning. Yeah. And he and I would talk about various things. And about my thing was good news, and I'd talk about it. Joe Beaver, the president of the bank. I would talk about how lucky we are another time. And the reason I'm bringing that radio show, and don't ask me out, but Dwight and I had a ball. And but my wife wanted me to stop it because she said, what is good news with all the problems that we're having in our community? And this was drugs. Yeah. And don't know the specific time frame, I went over to the Jiffy Mart, and one night, this is in the summer, and this was about 8 o'clock, 9 o'clock at night. I wanted some ice cream. This was 3 blocks from my house on Green Street. And you can't imagine what I saw that night. Young, testosterone-driven males from Baltimore en masse. And it was right afterwards that we had a major drug bust in this city. If you remember, this? I don't know the specific time frame. We actually hit national television on this with Barbara Mikulski involved. And it was a federal, state, county, and city drug bust. That's how serious it was. And I talked to Sam Leppo into that time frame, and I said, Sam, I just don't feel comfortable walking in the alley at night, the alley between my house and Main Street. And he said, Jack, do you have every reason to be concerned? He said, that's a major drug stashing point. And so anyhow, I really got involved at that point. And a lot of the people were annoyed with me. But you have to understand, this was my property, and I didn't want it to go down in value. And there were a lot of things I wanted. For instance, the coordination of services. In other words, instead of having a soup kitchen in one location, soup kitchen in another location in suburban areas, put it in a centralized point, downtown area. And I got involved in that. Of course, I hit feathers of the soup kitchen brigade at the one church and the other church and all these other things. And but it was nothing more than I wanted, and which a lot of people just didn't quite understand. I didn't want my property to go down in value, and I have a background for this because in Baltimore, my parents moved from the Northwood area to West Baltimore, and it was the time of the block busting in Baltimore. So I saw my neighborhood go from all white, basically, to the time we left when my parents came back here, to almost completely African American. So I've been involved in an area like that. I saw property values go down for whatever reason, and that's why I was concerned. And so my activism kept up. This is sort of interesting. The United Methodist Church had a phone, had a payphone on Main Street. And I begged the minister. I said, we need to get that payphone because I'd seen drug deals going on there. And I made an issue of this. And the police department came back on me and said, Jack, why are you doing this? This is a major focal point for our effort in order to find drug dealers on that payphone. And the payphone's not there anymore. But that's the type, and I wrote a weekly newsletter of all these activities and things like that. And it was my thing, Jim. I just think this community, it's a shame that we've got a college, McDaniel, formerly Western Maryland, and another college, Carroll Community College. We should be a dynamic downtown area, and we aren't. I mean, look at the vacant lots. Look at the, the changing environment of the population. And one of the biggest problems, and I talked as recently as, I guess 6 months ago to somebody about this, is the state has what they call a livability code. And the livability code is when a person leases an apartment, he has to live up to certain standards that the state says had.
Right.
And Westminster, I think they're doing something about it now, but didn't do a thing about this. And it was a peculiar sort of attitude. It was laissez-faire. Keep government off business. But these people that rented these apartments already were getting HUD and federal programs, so it was sort of a hypocrisy. I mean, why shouldn't government get involved with government activities on this thing? And also, Westminster probably still today has a lot of absentee landlords. And so therefore, these properties have been allowed to run down and not keep up. And you don't have to be a rocket scientist at this point to walk down, especially around the Carroll Theater north to the college, and on a given night, notice the type of individuals that are wandering around. I wouldn't want my college student at the McDaniel coming down into the Westminster area walking at night. I really wouldn't. And so, I mean, this is just an opinion. Other people may think it's safe, but it's still there. I mean, and so the things I fought for in the 90s and finally we moved are still a problem today. It's just that the population has shifted, and it's not the same as it was then. And it used to be that being poor was not a stigma in Westminster. In fact, one of the biggest poverty areas is up where the 7-Eleven is in the 30s, and that was a lot of people. But people, just because they were poor, it wasn't a stigma. And today, for whatever reason, there is a subclass of population, and this subclass population is living in rented property throughout the city of Westminster. So a lot of the things I got involved in are still a problem, still being addressed. And once again, Susan Albert, who's still on the Westminster City Council, nobody at Tom Baird. And nobody else has complained, Jack. And once again, you have to be united as part of a group and get involved on this thing. I have to tell you a funny story about Tom Baird. In the early 90s, I said one of the major problems going to be facing Westminster is water. Guess what?
It's water.
3 years ago, 4 years ago when we had a drought, water was a major, major problem. And it was funny that in fact, Damian Halstead came to me. He was on the city council and also, I guess, in charge of the city council, whatever the title is. And Damian paid me the ultimate compliment. He said, Jack, maybe we should have listened to you in the early 90s. Maybe that could be it. So anyhow, the sojourn continued from that point, and I've been an activist my whole life, and two reasons for my being an activist, and I think I maybe brought this up the first time. When I was getting a check, I get my net check, and I never thought about taxes. When I ran my business, I started seeing this money go out to government. Mm-hmm. And then I saw my FICA contribution in addition to that going out. Right. That's when I got involved. This was the early 70s. Mm-hmm. Then I had another experience, and I don't think I described this. I may have. If I'm being redundant, you will have remembered this story. I was with my wife. I'm thinking, did I tell about my Nashville experience being held up on the street? You sure? I may have told somebody else this story. But, and this is going to explain my activism and why I've gotten involved. My wife and I took a weekend, because we had 2 children in Birmingham, we took the train up to Nashville. And we had a wonderful time. One of the best martinis I've ever had was at the Hermitage at the hotel. And God, that was good. I still remember it with that big olive. But anyhow, that Sunday, we decided to go to a museum. And then in walking to that museum, we noticed this man coming up the street. And have you seen those Westerns with the long coats that the Western cowboys wear? Mm-hmm. And well, this guy was coming up the street. And suddenly he was where Ann and I were. Now, this was opposite the Greyhound bus station, but this wasn't the time where the Greyhound bus station was in the wrong part of town. Mm-hmm. This guy pulls a rifle on us. And there is this rifle at my stomach. And he asked me if I believed in the Lord Jesus Christ. I would have believed with anything at that point, with this rifle sticking at my gut. And I said, look, I don't care if you kill me. I said, please let my wife go. We've got 2 children. And he let her go. And I said, okay. I mean, I was cool as a cucumber. And it wasn't until later the next week I started trembling. And I said, okay, but, I wish you'd let me go. He said, you go too, follow her. Well, I didn't realize he was trying to kill me as I was running across. But he was trying to club me with this weapon as I was going across the street. Well, long story short, it was a misdemeanor because it was a toy rifle that he had stolen from a penny arcade. To me, who haven't been in the service, it looked like a carbine sticking in my stomach. And so, therefore, I thought it was a real rifle. And so that story is the reason why I have a real almost phobia about criminals. And so, therefore, you can possibly understand my activism with what I considered to be dangerous type people at the Jiffy Mart, going back earlier in this presentation. Then those net taxes and paying those net taxes. So those 2 things are the reason that I am what I am with the activism. And maybe I have some genes which prompted my A personality that maybe that has something to do with it too. But that explains the reason for this. And I'm going to end this. How long have we been now?
About 30 minutes.
30 minutes. Well, it's going to end because I don't have that much more to say. Because
I'd like to talk a little bit about the Union Mills Homestead.
Okay. Well, let me go then to the steps to that. Okay. We moved over to Willis Street in the anticipation of going back to Birmingham where our children were, and we lived at what is called the Thomas Apartments. This is right opposite the area where Myers Funeral Home is. There's an apartment house that became condominium. Then from there, we moved to where we live now on Fairfield Avenue. And I want to discuss this pops in another perspective, but I'm going to get into this. Well, anyhow, my business closed in 1994. Now, I'm not going to go into all the rest of this because this is going to be part of my next reinventing myself, and that's important to me because I want to give something back to the community through this media mode. I tried volunteerism, and I'm possibly the only person I know that's ever been fired as a volunteer, and I got fired twice. And I was at the hospital, and I was enthusiastic. I was running around with my blood and racing around the hallways. Yeah. And the head administrator of this program, I said, "Boy, you look nice today." Well, to the older women in the group, this was not expected of somebody as a volunteer. And in other words, they didn't think it was right that I should be complimenting. Of course, I've never been politically correct anyhow. And so anyhow, I ended my career as a volunteer in the hospital. Then I went to the Fire Museum. Now, I'd been a Santa Claus there for 3 years, but I didn't have a good feeling being a Santa Claus. I didn't like the whole general public. I went out to Union Mills and was a Santa Claus out there for 10 years. But I had a better feeling of the type of people out there versus the general public versus a certain type of public. I just, I enjoyed it better. I guess that's the way to say it. But anyhow, I was a volunteer at the Fire Museum. Well, I know how to make kids happy. I know how to make kids happy going through.
Sure.
And so, boy, I said, "I can't hear you." And they go, "I can't hear you." Well, anyhow, the other volunteers at the Fire Museum, "This isn't the way this should be. This should be reserved." Well, how can you be reserved to second graders? I don't know. But anyhow, you want second graders to have a good time. And then they wanted me to wear this little outfit with these little sort of leggings and stuff. And I said, so anyhow, I was fired from the Fire Museum. So for 2 different volunteer groups. And this leads, and I want to talk about a Dean Minnick editorial in closing today. And so anyhow, Union Mills, it pops. Perhaps the best thing I've ever done in my life. Here's the newspaper article. Probably the best thing I've ever done in my life. And, I don't know, I've done a lot of great things, but this just really makes me feel good. Because I was a volunteer out there. I was Santa Claus for 10, 12 years, and I stopped doing that. And then in the last several years, I started being a volunteer. Well, I'd take these school groups through, and I wasn't relating to them.
Right.
And there was a school teacher from Calvert School that came in one day, and honest to Pete, that man's enthusiasm, he'd been there before. And Jane Sewell, who's the executive director out there, oh golly, she's a wonderful human being. And she teaches at Calvert School also. And Jane, anyhow, I said, "Jane, I've got this program." I said, "I saw this school teacher from Calvert." Oh, he went in the first room there, the Power, 1866 Power, the last edition, I think, at the building, and pulled those Norman Rockwell publications that are in that room. And he put a fire into these kids about Norman Rockwell that you just can't believe.
Wow.
And I was incidental to my script. And we went upstairs to the children's room, and he got down on his hands and knees, said, "This is a rope bed," and discussed it. And these kids were just enraptured. I said, if he can do that, then I have my 17 years of Sunday school. I can do this too.
Sure.
And I went to Jane Sewell, and God bless her. I mean, I just can't say enough nice things. Most administrators don't want somebody underneath doing something. I mean, if you were government for 30 years, You know what I'm talking about. You don't want somebody to take independent initiative. You just don't want it because you don't know. But Jane gave me free hand. Well, it turned out to be one of the blessings of the homestead last year. Now, how I garnered the publicity this year, I don't know. I'm not going to get another newspaper article, that's for sure. But anyhow, that started it off. Well, anyhow, when a child, and I zeroed in second graders through sixth graders, yawns, when they yawn, I jump up and down, I blow a whistle. Well, anyhow, nobody wants to yawn.
Right.
And so they keep their mind set on this thing. And you know, I had some disadvantaged children, and I realized, I pulled back on that type of antic and that stuff like that. Sure. And then, you know, when we got into the room with the 1910 phonograph where you wind up, I then brought out my portable radio and played a Johnny Cash song.
Yeah.
And so they take what was then to today, and they're starting to learn about history.
Sure.
And then we got into the room with the 1900 Brownie, and I brought out my digital camera.
Right.
And took a picture of these children. And so on and so on. And I have pictures of things. And then I'd burst out in song. And I'd talk about the 1890 beaver hat. And I'd go, in your Easter bonnet, I'll be wearing my 1890 beaver hat. And I'd show a man a picture in there. And I kept this up all the way through. And I zero in on Jeb Stewart coming there. Because all this history unfolds in 45 minutes.
Right.
The Civil War, the phonograph, and how Bessie Kemp kept all these things is unbelievable to me. And then we got upstairs, and I'd start singing again, and I never knew what I was going to do.
Yeah.
And I put all this thing together in a format, and the result is history, because these kids, I mean, it was the biggest Wednesday attendance last year. And the Cora Collins and Jane Sewell, Dan Cox, and I were awarded the Volunteers of the Year award. And that was the most reluctant award I think I've ever gotten in my life.
Why is that?
I didn't want any rewards. Seeing those kids' faces is all I wanted. And I'm going to tell Jane about this. I didn't want a $50 gift certificate because, you know, volunteers work so hard.
Right.
And why should I get $50? I mean, not that I didn't enjoy it. We are going to enjoy it. We have something specific we're going to do with it. But I didn't want it. It was the first time in my life. I mean, I just, the feeling of these children being there and their smiles. Oh my God. I mean, their smiles. These kids, this is the first day, these children, they couldn't stop laughing. And I had to regroup on several occasions to get this thing done. So, and then I'm going to leave with the final story.
But your approach then was to make history interesting for these children.
Yes.
Make it exciting.
45
enjoyable.
minutes of history.
Yeah.
And
by making it entertaining.
Yes.
Yeah.
They you know, you know, grandchildren or children. Look at they're constantly being amused. And then I give a little present at the end, a little pencil, and something. So, and then you know, in other words, they get a little present. They go through and they laugh. They're entertained. That's like the Church of the Open Door, and some of these type of churches. they bring people in using modern media techniques and music to present a message. And, you know, like the Roman Catholic Church with the rock mass. I mean, this is how you get to people today. You don't, like what you're doing. It's media. It's the sophistication that's in the world today. And so this is what Pops in Union Mills was all about. And
how did you pick Pops?
Well, my grandchildren gave me a church, and it says Pops on the back. And I said, Jake, and they call me Pops. So I wear this shirt that says Pops. And I started off. We're going to be redundant on this on this other program. Okay. I get them on the porch, and we set the mode. And I said, that road out there used to be a major highway for stagecoaches and wagons. And this was the start of the Schreiber business out here. And they had a blacksmith shop. They had a cooper. Now, cooper is somebody that makes barrels. And this is the road they took, and that's where it is. Then what you're doing here, sitting here on this porch, is the way people entertain themselves, sitting after a Sunday meal and enjoying yourself without television and other things. Now I'm going to take you in, and Bessie and her family welcome you into their house as it was. And it's like no other museum I've ever been to. It's a living museum.
So the idea was to make the children comfortable. So they all usually have grandfathers, grandparents. And Pops is something that they'd be comfortable with. So you establish that right away while they're outside, and then take them inside to your home.
Yeah. Don't ask me. And I'm going to talk with you.
And it worked.
Oh, it worked. Of course it did. I mean, I've seen it happen. And this is what we're going to talk about the next time. But you don't have to be 74 and put like an ostrich your head in the sand. You can still be involved using all the things that you've learned in your life and relating them to today. I'm going to tell you one final story and get back to when all this crime was going on in Westminster, and you might be able to put this and edit it back in. Dean Minnick did an editorial on me at that point when he was writing for the Carroll County Times. And if you know Dean Minnick's history, he was with the Baltimore American with newspaper. And then he came up here and did some editorial writing for the Carroll County Times. Of course, then he eventually became commissioner. And he did an editorial about me and my he didn't use the word Don Quixote, Cervantes' approach to life. In other words, to my windmills that I'm going after in search of Dulcinea. He brought in my experience in Nashville and why I was what I am. And this editorial, I think I still have a copy. I should have a copy of that. But anyhow, that was an inspiration. And I don't think he ever thought I'd use this as my launching tool on everything I did at Dean Minnick. I think he sort of maybe even got annoyed with it. But it gave me a perfect... In other words, I use newspaper articles and stuff as a tool to further whatever else I'm doing, like like I'm going to show you the next time with a pamphlet and some other things. So, but anyhow, that's sort of an interesting story of how that editorial was in the Carroll County Times on the thing.
So, as we conclude our interview today, you've been around for a long time. You've seen a lot of changes in the community. A lot of things have happened. What do you think about the quality of life in Carroll County? Is it getting better?
No.
I know we've got a sour economy right now, and it's a little bit tough, and that's got to be a factor.
Well, I think something's been lost. I didn't think so at the time, and don't think I'm an old fogey in my thinking at this time, but the 50s really weren't a bad time. I mean, you grew up possibly non-thinking. You weren't aware of all the things going on, but you had hope. You had aspirations. And there was a song came out, a ticky-tacky little house, and it was the Levittown scenario. And what you did, you got married. And look today, I forget it, there's a number of unmarried couples. It's over 60% of the population or something like that. But you got married, had a child, put money into a savings account, got a beginner house, Levittown. Then you built up. And there was hope, there was future. And it was the beginning of happiness after the war. I mean, we had gotten through the war, economy was starting to boom again, and we took off. And it was simple. It was simple. I mean, we had a black and white TV set in our house on Gist Road on that fantastic football game. What was it, 1958? I think, yeah, it was 1958. The Baltimore Colts and the New York Giants, and Alan Amici and Johnny Unitas. And golly, my mother was having a Christmas party that night, and you know, just the excitement and the feeling and a black and white TV, and happy with that black and white TV. Sure. And you know, and of course the Colts were, you know, it's not like today with these multi-million-dollar guys. These guys went out in the community and had their hot dogs and went to Harry's and went to Balkers and stuff like that. But everybody had a good feeling. If you lived in Westminster, you were Doc Jeanette was the team doctor, and Doc Jeanette at the time was very good friends with my family. So I'm saying the 50s at the time seemed like a horrible time, but looking back on it, it wasn't really such a bad time. Right. And in comparison, go to out on 140 at any given moment. I mean, if you're on the side of town of where the Safeway is, and going out in that direction to Uniontown, it takes you almost 15 minutes to get over to the other side of town where Target is. And so, yeah, we've got so much more. We've got stores, supermarkets. Yeah. But are we that much happier? I don't know. I don't think so. Young people today, they got more freedoms than they've ever had. But going out to the college and seeing these young people, I feel sorry for them, Jim, because they don't have the hope that we had. You get your college degree. Yeah. I had a history undergraduate. Right. I had 3 or 4 job opportunities. Right. But they aren't going to get that with the liberal arts degree. They're going to have to get a master's degree. I liken this story, what I'm talking about right now, to when my son graduated from Wake Forest. I forget how many students, a couple of thousand. Meantime, the same weekend, North Carolina was graduating. Umpteen number, North Carolina State. And just into that Raleigh, Durham, Winston-Salem area, I got 10,000 liberal arts graduates. Right.
In a week.
In a week, yeah. That was that one area. Yeah. And so, are people happier? I don't know. I don't. One of the nicest young men that I've seen at school, these kids talk to me all the time out there. I'm going to bring up in my next session, going back to college, and he said, "Jack, I'm really depressed." And there's a lot of depression amongst young people. And you know, it used to be that the husband worked and the wife stayed at home, but the tax situation made it necessary for the woman to go out. So you need 2 incomes just to survive. So what does this mean? That means that people are working all the time, and they don't have time for their families, and they put their kids in the 2 daycare centers. Yeah. So you ask me whether I have a feeling that people are happier. And as I talk to people, everybody I talk to, older people, what's going to happen? How's it going to happen? You know, just like this morning, in the Baltimore Sun, they're talking about doing away with your tax deduction for a mortgage.
Right.
That's sort of scary. Like my son, and and my daughter, their families, they're depending on that to net out better. And now the government is talking about.
Yeah.
Look at the government. And I'm a libertarian in viewpoint, and not that way fiscally responsible. But look at what they were going to do about this estate tax. They brought it all the way down to $1 million. And, the people that are making 10, 20, lots of money, they don't care at that point with the 55%. But the government is so much involved in our lives. I mean,
but Jack, what you're talking about is not a Westminster situation or a Carroll County situation. It's our culture.
Yes.
It's a cultural situation.
Yeah.
So you're talking about our culture's changed since the 50s to today.
Yeah.
What can we do about this?
Oh, Jim, I think it starts not necessarily with the conservative evangelistic type approach, God, that's necessary. It has to start with values. And, in our way, we've gotten away from values. It's okay to go out and have sex. You don't have to be married. The pill in 1960 changed all of that.
Yeah.
And so now, girls are free to do whatever they want. Remember that story I told you about the young girls that, oh, that's silly to hold my hand. Girls did control that situation. Believe me, they did in those days, okay? And I'm just saying values. Maybe I was talking on an overall viewpoint, but Carroll County, is this a nicer place up here? You've seen it change in the last farmland being developed, Walmarts, just everything. It's just, we're into, my God, can't we slow down? Can't we, like Union Mills in 1866, sit on a front porch and just enjoy a Sunday afternoon? We've only had one time, and this was in the early 70s, when Jimmy Carter imposed these 55-mile speed limit. I think it was Jimmy Carter's administration. And people couldn't get gas.
Yeah.
And I think it was Jimmy Carter's administration. I'm not so sure, but it was into that time frame because I got my one speeding ticket, and because I was going 70 miles coming into Bessemer, Alabama. And it just changed. That's how I remember. Some events just stick in your mind. And anyhow, people were forced to stay home. And I think we need a good dose of that today. And we don't, as a nation, don't respect other people's values. I mean, who are we to go over into the Muslim world and say, gee, women ought to do this and women ought to do that? Those people truly don't understand the Muslim culture, which is not only a religion, but it's a way of governing. And who are we to tell somebody else that, you can't do this? I mean, it's that we have no respect. Nobody has any respect.
So let me ask you this, Jack. If you were going to offer some advice to a young person, one of these college students that's getting ready to get a degree and get out on their own and maybe try to buy a house and try to buy a car and try to raise a family, what advice would you give them?
I do it all the time, Jim. I recommend that they don't get liberal arts degrees. I recommend I'll give you just a classic example of a young person. I can't mention her name, I don't think that would be wise. I liked her right off the bat. Hi, Jack, she said to me one day, and had a personality. That girl has her head on her shoulders. You got to start getting focused, number one. You can't willy-nilly walk through with an opportunity standing you in the face.
Right.
And I'm going to the University of Maryland. And that's what she's going to do. And she has her outline of exactly what she wants to do. She is programmed. She is thinking ahead. My great-nephew has a beautiful young lady that he's dating. He's in his 30s. She's now going into her residency. You've got to stay focused.
Right.
Instead of sitting around doing nothing, try to zero into a summer job that you're interested in that could relate on a resume that you could take after you graduate, saying, I've been working into this type of capacity and growing into this capacity. And I'm saying, so therefore you stay focused, you have a goal. But these young people, I mean, Dr. Pappalardo mentioned that, retention, and you've got students out at the community colleges go to school and they're there 4 or 5 terms just taking courses. And one young person, just smart as she could be, taking Chinese, and into her second year of Chinese, writes, and I told one of the teachers because he had a discussion board blog, I felt like an amateur in my writing in comparison to this young person. Oh, I don't want to get a degree because I'd have to take math, the math requirement. I said, what you got to do, if you're that concerned about math, take it on an audit basis, get through your scares, and then go on. You can't believe the young people I'm counseling.
Sure.
I mean, I've had 17 years in the recruiting business, so they're, and you know who they are. I mean, they can be a pain in the neck to human resource people. But
so you're saying then that a young person should try to figure out what they want to do by experimentation a little bit. If you have an idea that you want to do something or want to have a career in something, find a summer job that will allow you to exercise some of that, to learn about that, to make sure that it's a nice fit for you. And then it also looks good on a resume because that's experience that you have in that field. Well, anything you do is going to look good on a resume.
Yeah.
It's going to be something.
Anything. And as I talk to you that I'm going to talk about next time, these people got to wake up about these daggone Fs on these these transcripts. And you and I just talked about that before. I mean, I don't care whether you go to McDaniel or where you go. That F on that resume is
it will haunt you.
It's going to be there forever.
So what other advice? What other advice for a young person that's going to start a family and start a career?
Well, this is interesting. I'm in my philosophy course one day, and this young guy said, "Oh, I want to get a job so I can support my family." And this girl said, "Oh, that's what I want, is be supported." Well, that's not today's world. And that young person, "Oh, I'm going to major in history." And I'll give you a story about that. And I don't care who you are. It's not like it used to be. Everybody, male or female, has to stand on their own 2 feet. You've got to get as much education as you can. You've got to get yourself in the competition is not in the United States. It's a worldwide competition. And we as a country, we don't have jobs like we used to. And there aren't ever going to be these jobs again.
Right.
I mean, we used to be a major steel company in Baltimore, Bethlehem Steel.
That's correct.
And go down to Hickory, North Carolina, where we live, big textile area, no more textiles. Right. And you know, the Walmarts of the world have as had much to do with outsourcing jobs as anybody does. True, we get cheap prices in return, but now we've built up China, who is now manufacturing textiles and steel and stuff like that. So these young people got to be able to compete. They got to be able to compete in engineering-related type subjects. They've got to be able to understand if they can go out on their own, which I've had the privilege of doing. That is a ultimate salvation. There's nothing wrong with being a plumber. There's nothing wrong with being an electrician. Used to be a stigma of the electrician. He wanted his son to go to college so that his son wouldn't have to do that. And young people today, I'm fortunate. Both of my children are better off than I am. But it's not always going to be that way. The African American community has learned that the hardest way on this thing, is that the people that have risen above the inner cities, have gone to college, that their children are not going to be able to have as good a life or better life. It's really a phenomenon going on the inner cities at this point. So, you know, it's a world that I don't understand. It's a world that's changing. It's a world that we are no longer a major factor as a country. We're starting to into the descent of being almost a second-rate power. And I think I'm scared for my children, grandchildren. I'll give you a story about my own son. And I can be all talk on this, okay? But my son is an extremely smart guy. He's now director of trust department and a part of a bank that actually started in the middle of all this. And it's one of the top growing banks, I mean, not large-wise, but in the country right now, and he's part of this. Did it on his own. But he screwed around in school. And he had himself one heck of a good time. But fortunately, he went to a good school. You know, a named school such as Wake Forest University. That's another thing. Young people, that college where you go, like University of Baltimore, University of Maryland, Baltimore County, I think it is, UMBC, that happens to be one of the better up-and-coming schools in the whole United States. And I'm saying you need to get a credential of a good named school. And so that was in his saving grace. And he screwed around, and we finally got him into law school at a second-tier law school. And I'm talking first-tier, you know, Harvard, Dartmouth. He had third-tier law school. And University of Baltimore's in a second-tier. That's a good law school, by the way. And he got a 2.8, which at Wake Forest cum laude was 3.0. If he applied himself, he would have done that. Well, he got into school, law school. He didn't flunk out, but he got a 2.5. And he came home after 4 years of graduation and 1 year of law school. And we were on Green Street at the time. And it's the day of reckoning, he calls it. I said, what are you going to do, John? I'm going to get a job, $80,000 a year. Well, an $80,000 a year job is still a good job. Median income in Carroll County, I think $69,000 or something like that. That was a recent report. And so 80,000, when you take a medium as the extremes, you can have that extreme, and the median takes all that, and the medium income is right in between, something from statistics that I remember. And I said, you're going to go back to school. I don't think I like this. The day right, he walked out of that house, and I didn't know where he was going to go or what he was going to do, and I was panicked. Well, he did go back to school, and got 4.0 down at the University of Baltimore in prerequisites, And then he got a summer job with Mercantile because I had some accounts.
Yeah.
And that was at a time that a normal account was worthwhile. Now, unless you have $5 million, $8 million, they don't care about you anymore. And those big banks, they don't care. Anyhow, he got a job. He did very well. And then he came back. They asked him to come back, but into the trust department. And Mercantile had one of the foremost trust departments in the United States. And he did so well in that they offered him a job before he got his MBA at the University of Baltimore.
Wow.
And he has parlayed that into what he is today. And I'm saying, hopefully, a young person can learn from my own son's experience. Don't get to that state. And because a lot of these people I see out at this school are even worse shape.
In other words, take it seriously.
Yeah. It's no longer fun and games. I mean, you can still go to college and have fun.
Sure.
Like my grandson is at the University of Alabama, but I'm going to end this.
It's your future.
Yeah. This is a whole separate topic that we've covered here today. I mean, this is almost independent of everything else we've done.
Okay.
But I'm going to make a point of this. You've seen a lot of guys come and go and a lot of women come and go here. But if you listen to me, I'm 74 years old. I'm probably more current than most younger people. And the only reason I'm current is I forced myself to be current and going back to college. I think a guy named Kaufman wrote this, that you've got two selves, your outer selves. And I took a philosophy course. I'm going to sound really erudite right now. And you got your inner self. And there were two people, and I'm caught off guard on this, but the idea was, and I wrote on my paper, all these subjects keep coming up, but you got your outer self. Well, I'm 74, so I'm an old man. And as I wrote on this paper, I'm one of those gray-haired people that young people hate to see and bonk their horns and get road rage at. But underneath, I'm a 25-year-old just bursting to come out. And that's something I just learned from philosophy this term. And I'm going to leave you with one final thought, young people. I went in this class. I go in every one of my classes, and I'm going to do work. I'm going to do something. Well, I realized if I were going to do these readings on Kaufman and Rogers and Plato and Freud and Kant and all these guys, there was no way in God's world you couldn't understand it unless you did as the teacher wanted you to do, turn in a paper every week on what you had read that week. Because there's just no way that you could understand these guys and you'd casually read it. But going in, they got such tools. You go into the internet. And that's how I studied my philosophy course, and I pulled up something written in the day. And on Wikipedia. And you pull something you read today, then relate it to that. Well, anyhow, I did all this work, turned in all these papers. Some person, "You going to do what?" I said, "Yeah, I'm going to turn in these." I can't believe you're doing that and not even getting credit for it. But that is a prevailing attitude, you know, wanting to learn is a real gift at my age. To be able to go back and take a philosophy course I would have been afraid to take in the 50s. I would have flunked this course in the 50s. As it is, I took courses where I knew I'd get good grades. I had to take things like calculus and things like that. And bottom line of this, I mean, this isn't any big deal, but I was 19 out of 169, so it's not bad. And
everybody wants to know what's in it for me. Everybody wants to know what's in it for me in the end.
Self-centered.
And what you're saying, what's in it for you, is to learn.
Yeah.
And sometimes that's enough. And quite frankly, if you learn, you can grow. And that's got value in and of itself.
Jim, as I said, how many guys my age are walking in here being able to talk this way? The only reason.
Yeah.
I'm back in school.
Yeah. Well, Jack, I want to thank you. It was a very interesting discussion today.